You should never call the police before you know who's standing in front of you. At 9:12 on a cold Thursday morning, two security guards stepped into the marble lobby of Pierce Global and reached for Caleb Mercer before he had even finished signing the visitor log. The younger guard moved first, broad shoulders, polished badge, hand already hovering near the radio clipped to his belt. "Sir, you need to leave the building immediately." Caleb looked up slowly from the reception counter. Rainwater still darkened the shoulders of his old brown jacket. Beside him stood a little girl in a pale blue sweater, holding a stuffed rabbit against her chest with both arms. She couldn't have been older than 7. The receptionist behind the desk avoided eye contact completely. Caleb glanced once toward the towering glass elevators at the center of the lobby, then back at the guard. "I'm here to speak with Madeline Pierce." The second guard let out a quiet laugh. "Yeah," he said, "and I'm here to buy the Yankees." A few nearby employees smiled without looking up from their phones. Sophie pressed closer against her father's side. Caleb rested one hand lightly on her shoulder. Calm, controlled, like a man already used to rooms turning against him. 40 floors above the lobby, Madeline Pierce stood inside the executive boardroom, watching the security feed from a wall-mounted screen. 29 years old, white blazer, hair pinned perfectly into place. Every inch of her looked engineered for authority. Pierce Global's emergency acquisition vote would begin in less than 18 minutes, and every executive in the building already knew the number attached to the deal. $4.2 billion. One delayed signature could shake markets before lunch. Then she saw Caleb Mercer standing in her lobby, looking like a man who had walked out of a storm shelter. Old boots, worn jacket, child beside him, one sealed gray envelope tucked beneath his arm. Madeline narrowed her eyes. "Who let him inside?" "Nobody," answered immediately. Finally, her assistant spoke carefully. "He says he needs to speak with you personally." Madeline didn't hesitate. "Call the police." Downstairs, the younger guard touched his earpiece. "NYPD is already on the way." Sophie looked up at her father. "Dad." Her voice was tiny in the enormous marble lobby. "Did we do something wrong?" Several employees glanced over. Caleb crouched slightly, so he was eye level with her. He brushed a strand of blonde hair away from her face and gave the smallest shake of his head. "No, sweetheart," he said quietly. "Some people just make decisions too fast." The lobby door slid open behind them as more employees entered from the rain outside. A few slowed when they noticed security surrounding the man near reception. One woman discreetly lifted her phone and started recording. Another whispered, "Probably another lawsuit psycho." Sophie heard it. Caleb knew she heard it because her fingers tightened around the stuffed rabbit immediately afterward. But he never reacted, never raised his voice, never defended himself. That was the strange part. People who were guilty usually spoke too much. Caleb Mercer barely spoke at all. Upstairs, Madeline turned away from the monitor and gathered the acquisition documents from the conference table. "I don't want disruptions today," she said coldly. "Remove him before the board arrives." But as she reached for the final folder, her assistant suddenly frowned at the lobby feed. "Wait," she said softly. "Why is he still holding that envelope like that?" On the monitor below, Caleb stood completely still between the guards while rainwater dripped quietly from the edge of his jacket sleeve onto the polished marble floor. And for the first time that morning, someone in the building began to realize he did not look nervous at all. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and every conversation in the lobby lowered half a level as Madeline Pierce stepped out surrounded by executives in dark suits carrying tablets and folders against their chests. She moved quickly, heels sharp against the marble, expression cold enough to make employees straighten the moment they saw her. Sophie noticed it immediately. Some people became quieter when her father entered a room. People became afraid when Madeline Pierce entered one. Caleb remained exactly where he was between the two security guards, one hand resting lightly against the gray envelope beneath his arm, while rainwater slowly dried across the seams of his jacket. Madeline stopped 10 feet away from him and looked first at Sophie, then at the worn boots, then finally at Caleb's face. "You are delaying a board meeting involving $4 billion, she said. "This is your last opportunity to leave peacefully." Caleb met her eyes without flinching. "I asked your office for 12 days to schedule this meeting." "Then you should have taken the silence as your answer." Several executives behind her smiled faintly at that. One older board member whispered something under his breath that caused another man beside him to chuckle quietly. Sophie looked down at the floor. Caleb noticed. He always noticed. Madeline, he said calmly, if that vote happens today, your company is going to collapse before the market closes. The smile disappeared from the nearest executive almost immediately. Madeline crossed her arms. Do you know how many unstable people say things like that to corporations every year? I am not threatening you. Then what exactly are you doing? Caleb glanced once toward the giant digital display mounted above the reception desk. 9:17 had become 9:23. The countdown beneath the Pierce Global logo now read 16 minutes until shareholder authorization. He looked back at her, trying to stop you from making the worst mistake of your life. The younger security guard shifted his stance awkwardly. Something about Caleb's voice was beginning to bother him. Not anger, not desperation. The opposite. The man sounded too calm for someone surrounded by security with police cars pulling up outside. Through the glass front entrance, flashing blue lights reflected faintly across the rain-soaked street. Several employees moved closer now, pretending to check messages while quietly watching everything unfold. Phones remained low at waist-level recording. Madeline noticed and straightened further. Public weakness inside Pierce Global spread like infection. She had learned that during her first year as chief executive. You have 30 seconds before the police escort you out, she said. Sophie tugged softly at Caleb's sleeve. Dad, her voice trembled this time. Can we just go home? Caleb looked down at her stuffed rabbit. One ear had been stitched back together by hand. Probably more than once. He crouched slightly beside her again. Not yet, sweetheart. Why? For a moment he did not answer. Then he said quietly enough that only the people closest heard it. Because your mom trusted me to finish this. The sentence landed strangely in the lobby. Heavy, personal, real. Even Madeline's assistant shifted uncomfortably. Before anyone could speak again, the front doors opened hard, and an older man in a charcoal overcoat stepped quickly inside, carrying a leather briefcase against his side. His silver hair was damp from the rain. He scanned the lobby once and froze the moment he saw Caleb Mercer standing between security guards. Absolute silence crossed his face first, then disbelief, then something dangerously close to fear. One of the board members blinked in confusion. That is Harrison Vale, he whispered. Why is the company attorney down here? Harrison did not answer anyone. He walked directly past Madeline Pierce without acknowledging her at all. Then he stopped in front of Caleb and stared at the gray envelope tucked beneath his arm. Dear God, he said under his breath. You actually came in person. Madeline Pierce stared at Harrison Vale as though the company attorney had suddenly begun speaking another language. For 11 years, Harrison had represented Pierce Global through acquisitions, federal reviews, labor disputes, and shareholder litigation worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He was not a man who lost composure publicly. Yet now his attention remained fixed entirely on Caleb Mercer and the sealed gray envelope under his arm. You know this man? Madeline asked sharply. Harrison did not answer immediately. His eyes moved toward the two security guards standing beside Caleb, then toward the flashing police lights outside the glass entrance. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded lower than before. Tell the officers outside they are no longer needed. Madeline blinked once. Excuse me. Now, Madeline. The firmness in his tone caused several executives nearby to exchange uneasy looks. The younger security guard hesitated before slowly reaching for his radio. Madeline stepped forward before he could speak into it. Nobody is canceling anything until someone explains what is happening. Harrison exhaled carefully through his nose. What is happening, he said, is that your board meeting cannot legally proceed until you review whatever is inside that envelope. A ripple moved through the lobby. Phones lowered slightly. Even the employees pretending not to watch were openly staring now. Caleb remained silent through all of it. That silence was beginning to affect people more than shouting would have. Madeline looked at him again, studying him properly for the first time since coming downstairs. 38 maybe. Tired eyes. Wedding ring no longer worn, but still visible through the pale line around his finger. A man who looked like he slept less than he should and carried responsibilities heavier than his appearance suggested. Nothing about him matched the picture of someone who could disrupt a $4 billion acquisition. And yet Harrison Vale looked genuinely unsettled standing near him. Sophie quietly shifted closer against her father's side as another burst of rain rattled faintly against the glass exterior of the building. She looked up at Harrison. Are we still in trouble? Harrison's entire expression softened the moment he heard her voice. No, sweetheart, he said gently. I do not think you ever were. Madeline noticed that too. Harrison Vale did not soften around anyone, especially not during corporate emergencies. Enough, Madeline said coldly. I have investors upstairs waiting for signatures. If this is some kind of pressure tactic, it is not, Caleb interrupted calmly. His voice was quiet, but the interruption itself froze the lobby. Men like him did not interrupt chief executives inside their own buildings unless they had a reason. Caleb adjusted the envelope slightly beneath his arm. 3 weeks ago, I sent certified notices to your office regarding the Helix acquisition. Madeline frowned. I have never heard of you. That is because someone inside your executive office intercepted every letter before it reached you. A subtle shift crossed Harrison's face. Small. Dangerous. Madeline caught it immediately. What letters? She demanded. Harrison looked toward her slowly. Madeline, what letters? He hesitated too long. That alone was enough to raise panic inside her chest for the first time that morning. Behind them, the giant digital countdown above the reception desk changed again. 12 minutes until shareholder authorization. Caleb glanced toward it briefly. If the vote happens before you read those documents, he said quietly, Pierce Global becomes legally exposed to federal fraud investigations before noon. Absolute silence followed the sentence. One executive near the elevators actually laughed once in disbelief before stopping halfway through when nobody joined him. Madeline folded her arms tighter. You expect me to believe a man who walked into my lobby in work boots is threatening my corporation with federal charges? Caleb looked directly at her. Calm. Steady. No, he said. I expect you to believe your father's signature. Harrison Vale closed his eyes for half a second the moment the words left Caleb's mouth. And suddenly the entire lobby felt colder. Madeline Pierce did not speak for several seconds after hearing the words your father's signature. The silence itself began changing the atmosphere in the lobby. Employees who had been casually watching now looked genuinely uncomfortable. Even the board members near the elevators had stopped pretending this was a routine disturbance. Harrison Vale slowly removed his glasses and rubbed one hand across his face before looking back at Caleb Mercer. You should have called me directly, he said quietly. Caleb gave a faint shake of his head. I did. Harrison lowered his eyes for a moment. That answer hit harder than anyone around them understood. Madeline noticed immediately. What exactly is going on? She demanded. Harrison looked toward her carefully, like a man deciding how much truth a room could survive at once. 3 weeks ago, he said, a restricted legal review connected to the Helix acquisition triggered a dormant trust clause established by your father 12 years ago. Madeline frowned. That is impossible. My father retired 6 years ago. Yes, Harrison replied. But the clause remained active. Caleb stood motionless while every pair of eyes in the lobby slowly shifted toward him again. Sophie tightened both arms around her stuffed rabbit. The giant digital display above reception changed once more. 10 minutes until shareholder authorization. Madeline stepped closer to Harrison. What trust clause? She asked. Harrison hesitated. A contingency oversight provision. For who? This time Harrison did not answer at all. He simply looked at Caleb. That was enough. Madeline turned sharply toward him. No, the word came out immediately. Instinctively. Like rejection before thought. There is absolutely no way this man has anything to do with my father's corporate authority. Caleb finally spoke again. Your father believed companies fail when nobody inside them is allowed to say no. Madeline stared at him. You knew my father? Very well. Her expression hardened immediately. My father did not spend time with mechanics in work jackets. Caleb almost smiled at that. Almost. No, he said quietly. He spent time with people who told him the truth. The sentence landed harder than the one before it. Several executives shifted uncomfortably. Madeline's father, Charles Pierce, had built Pierce Global into one of the largest infrastructure investment firms on the East Coast. But inside the company, people rarely spoke about him comfortably anymore. He had retired after a prolonged illness and had not appeared publicly in nearly 2 years. Most employees only knew him from photographs in hallways and framed magazine covers in conference rooms. Yet Caleb Mercer spoke about him like a man remembering conversations instead of headlines. Outside, another police officer stepped through the glass entrance carrying a notepad beneath one arm. The younger security guard moved toward him quickly. "It is handled," he said under his breath. The officer glanced toward Caleb, then toward the executives gathered in the lobby. "Does not look handled." Sophie looked at the officer nervously. Caleb rested a hand against her shoulder again. Calm. Protective. Never panicked. That calmness was infecting the room now in ways nobody liked. Madeline folded her arms tighter. "Fine," she said coldly. "Open the envelope." Caleb did not move. "Not here." "Why?" "Because once those documents are visible, half the people standing around us are going to start making phone calls." Another uncomfortable silence followed. Harrison Vale checked his watch. 9 minutes remaining. Madeline noticed it. "You are telling me," she said carefully, "that whatever is inside that envelope can stop a $4 billion acquisition." Caleb looked directly at her. No, his voice remained steady. "I am telling you it can destroy it." The words settled over the lobby like a pressure drop before a storm. Somewhere near the reception desk, a phone vibrated loudly against marble because nobody remembered to silence it. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And for the first time since coming downstairs, Madeline Pierce began to feel something she had not felt in years. Uncertainty. The tension inside the lobby shifted again the moment Madeline Pierce said, "Take us upstairs." Nobody argued with her, but nobody moved immediately either. That hesitation alone told her something had already slipped out of her control. Harrison Vale adjusted his overcoat and stepped aside near the elevator, while Caleb Mercer remained exactly where he was beside Sophie. Calm, patient, as though time no longer belonged to anyone else in the building. The police officer near the entrance glanced toward his partner uncertainly. "So we are done here?" Harrison answered before anyone else could. "Yes, officer. Thank you." The officer looked unconvinced but gave a small nod before stepping back outside into the rain. Several employees quietly lowered their phones the moment the police left. The younger security guard finally exhaled, though he still could not shake the feeling that he had almost made a serious mistake without understanding why. Madeline pressed the elevator call button herself. "Nobody enters the boardroom except the people already standing here," she said sharply. "And if anyone leaks a word of this before the vote, they are finished at this company." Normally statements like that landed with immediate obedience. Today nobody answered. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. Caleb waited for Sophie to step inside first. That small detail did not escape Madeline. Neither did the way Harrison Vale instinctively held the elevator door for the little girl instead of for the executives. Tiny shifts, tiny betrayals of priority. But they were happening everywhere now. The ride to the 40th floor felt longer than it should have. Nobody spoke during the ascent. Sophie leaned quietly against her father, holding the stuffed rabbit beneath her chin while rain streaked across the glass exterior of the building outside them. Caleb stood near the back corner of the elevator with the same unreadable expression he had carried since entering Pierce Global. Madeline watched him carefully now. She had spent years studying negotiators, investors, hostile buyers, activists, politicians, men who tried to intimidate her through silence or charm or pressure. Caleb Mercer did not resemble any of them. He looked exhausted, not weak, just tired in the deep, permanent way of people carrying responsibilities without help. And somehow that unsettled her more. The elevator doors opened directly into the executive floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed Manhattan beneath gray rain clouds while assistants and analysts hurried through glass hallways carrying folders and coffee trays. Conversation stopped almost immediately when they saw Madeline walking beside security, Harrison Vale, and a man in an old work jacket carrying a sealed envelope. By the time they reached the boardroom entrance, the countdown clock mounted beside the acquisition screen read 4 minutes until shareholder authorization. Inside, 12 board members already sat around the long walnut conference table. Conversations died instantly the moment Caleb entered the room with Sophie beside him. One older investor removed his glasses slowly. Another frowned openly at Harrison Vale. "What exactly is this?" Madeline walked to the head of the table, but did not sit down. "A delay," she said, coldly. "Temporary." Caleb remained standing near the far end of the room. Sophie stayed beside him, clutching the rabbit against her chest, while quietly staring at the enormous skyline beyond the windows. One board member leaned toward another and whispered, "Why is there a child in here?" Harrison placed his leather briefcase carefully on the table. "Because she belongs with her father." The room fell silent again. Madeline extended one hand toward Caleb. The envelope. Caleb looked at her for a long moment before finally stepping forward. Every eye in the room followed the gray envelope as he placed it carefully onto the polished walnut table between them. Nobody breathed. Nobody moved. The sound of rain tapping against the glass windows suddenly seemed unnaturally loud. Madeline slid one finger beneath the seal and opened the envelope slowly. The first page appeared ordinary at first glance. Legal formatting. Dense language. Trust authorization references. Then she reached the final signature line near the bottom of the page. Her father's name, Charles Pierce, signed 12 years earlier. Her expression changed instantly. Madeline Pierce stared at the signature for so long that one of the board members finally shifted uncomfortably in his chair and asked, "What is it?" She did not answer. Her eyes moved across the page again, more slowly this time, scanning the legal references beneath her father's signature. Contingency authority transfer. Emergency voting suspension rights. Oversight activation conditions tied to executive misconduct and concealed financial exposure. The words seemed unreal sitting there in black ink beneath the Pierce Global letterhead. Harrison Vale quietly removed another document from the envelope and slid it beside the first. "There is more," he said. Madeline looked at him sharply. "You knew about this?" Harrison hesitated. "I knew the trust existed. I did not know Charles activated it." A low murmur spread through the boardroom immediately. Caleb Mercer remained standing near the far end of the table beside Sophie, who had climbed quietly into one of the leather chairs too large for her feet to touch the floor. She sat hugging the stuffed rabbit while staring silently at the rain beyond the windows. The contrast inside the room had become impossible to ignore now. Billion-dollar executives in tailored suits sitting frozen around a conference table while a little girl in light-up sneakers waited quietly beside the man none of them understood. Madeline flipped to the next page. Her breathing slowed slightly as she read, then stopped again. "No," she said under her breath. One of the investors leaned forward. "Madeline." She looked up slowly toward Caleb. "This says the contingency authority was assigned to a private trustee selected personally by my father." Caleb gave a small nod. "Correct. That is impossible." "No," Harrison said quietly. "It is legal." The room fell silent again. One board member reached for the documents, but Madeline pulled them slightly closer first. "Why would my father give this authority to someone outside the company?" she demanded. Caleb answered before Harrison could. "Because everyone inside the company already depended on him." The sentence settled heavily across the table. Madeline looked back down at the paperwork again. There it was, printed clearly beneath the legal trust language. Trustee designation, Caleb Mercer. Several people around the table visibly stiffened when they finally saw the name themselves. One executive actually removed his glasses as though rereading the page might somehow change it. Another whispered, "Who the hell is this man?" Harrison folded his hands carefully in front of him. 12 years ago, Charles Pierce personally established an independent review structure in case the company was ever exposed to coordinated internal fraud tied to executive leadership or acquisition manipulation. Madeline looked up sharply. "Fraud?" Harrison nodded once. "The Helix acquisition triggered the review conditions 3 weeks ago." A board member near the center of the table frowned deeply. "What exactly are we talking about here?" Caleb finally stepped forward again. Slow. Controlled. Every eye followed him automatically now. The acquisition numbers presented to this board were artificially stabilized through concealed debt transfers and fabricated infrastructure valuations. The words landed like stones dropped into water. Nobody reacted immediately because nobody wanted to be the first person to fully understand what he had just said. Madeline's face hardened. "That is a serious accusation." Caleb met her gaze steadily. "That is why I spent 12 days trying to reach you privately before walking into your lobby this morning." Her jaw tightened slightly. "Who manipulated the reports?" Caleb looked toward the far end of the table. Not at Madeline. Not at Harrison. At someone else. A man in his early 50s sitting beside the acquisition analyst suddenly stopped moving altogether. Richard Halpern, Chief Financial Director. Until that moment, he had remained mostly silent through the meeting. Now a thin layer of sweat appeared near his collar despite the cold air inside the boardroom. Caleb noticed. Harrison noticed. And slowly, one by one, so did the rest of the room. Sophie looked quietly toward her father. Dad? She asked softly. Caleb never took his eyes off Richard Halpern when he answered. It is okay, sweetheart. Richard finally forced a laugh that sounded completely wrong in the silence. This is insane, he said. We are seriously entertaining accusations from a man who walked in here wearing construction boots. Nobody laughed with him. That was when Richard Halpern realized the room had already changed sides. Richard Halpern tried to hold his expression together, but panic had already started leaking through the edges. It showed in the tightness around his mouth first, then in the way his fingers stopped resting naturally against the conference table. Madeline Pierce noticed all of it. She had spent years in negotiation rooms learning how to recognize fear disguised as confidence. And Richard suddenly looked terrified. This is ridiculous, he said again, louder this time. You are allowing a complete outsider to walk into a private board meeting and throw around accusations without evidence. Caleb Mercer reached into the gray envelope once more and removed a thinner stack of documents secured with a black binder clip. He slid them slowly across the walnut table toward Madeline. Pages 14 through 22, he said quietly. Start there. Nobody spoke while she turned the pages. The only sound inside the room came from rain tapping softly against the 40-story glass windows overlooking Manhattan. Madeline's eyes moved faster now. Debt transfers, offshore holding structures, internal valuation adjustments, then a series of authorization codes tied directly to Richard Halpern's executive credentials. She stopped turning pages. Richard leaned forward immediately. Those numbers are taken out of context. Harrison Vale looked toward him calmly. Would you like to explain the context? Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again. Across the room, Sophie sat quietly swinging her legs slightly beneath the oversized leather chair. She watched the adults carefully the way children do when they realize something important is happening, but nobody will explain it clearly. Dad? She whispered softly. Why does everyone look scared? The question landed in the room harder than anyone expected. Caleb looked toward her. Because some people waited too long to tell the truth. Nobody moved after he said it. Madeline slowly leaned back in her chair while still staring at the documents in front of her. The Helix valuation reports were inflated by almost $800 million, she said quietly. No one answered. One of the board members reached for the paperwork with trembling fingers and scanned the pages himself. Another executive removed his glasses and rubbed both eyes slowly like a man developing a headache in real time. Richard forced out a short laugh again, but this one sounded desperate. You cannot seriously believe this, he said. These are draft analyses. Half-finished projections. Caleb shook his head once. No, the drafts are in the appendix. Richard's face drained slightly. Caleb continued calmly. Those pages are the finalized transfer structures submitted 48 hours ago. Harrison Vale opened his briefcase and removed a second folder. I verified the timestamps myself this morning. Richard turned sharply toward him. You had no authority to access those files. Harrison met his stare evenly. Actually, under the Pierce Contingency Trust, Caleb Mercer does. Silence. Heavy. Suffocating. Madeline slowly lifted her eyes toward Caleb again. Why would my father trust you with this? She asked quietly. Caleb looked out toward the rain-covered skyline for a moment before answering. Because 12 years ago I stopped him from signing another deal exactly like this one. Several board members frowned immediately. Madeline's expression changed again. You worked for my father? Caleb nodded once. Strategic risk analysis. Nobody in the room could reconcile the sentence with the man standing before them. The worn jacket. The old boots. The quiet little girl holding a stuffed rabbit beside him. One executive finally asked the question everyone else was thinking. If you work directly with Charles Pierce, then why are you not still inside the company? Caleb remained silent for several seconds before answering. Because after my wife died, I stopped caring about power. The honesty of the sentence emptied the room completely. No performance. No self-pity. Just truth. Sophie quietly slid off the leather chair and walked over beside him again, resting her head gently against his arm. Caleb placed one hand lightly on her shoulder without taking his eyes off the boardroom table. Across from him, Madeline Pierce looked down at the documents again, then slowly toward Richard Halpern. For the first time since becoming chief executive of Pierce Global, she realized the man she trusted most inside the company might have been the one lying to her the entire time. No one in the boardroom looked at Richard Halpern the same way after that. The shift was subtle at first. A chair moved slightly farther away from him. An investor quietly closed the folder he had been reviewing and folded his hands together instead. One executive stopped making eye contact with him entirely. Richard noticed every bit of it. Fear began changing him physically now. His forehead glistened beneath the recessed lighting above the conference table, and his breathing no longer sounded steady in the silence. "This is still circumstantial," he said carefully. "None of this proves criminal intent." "Harrison," Vale answered immediately. "Actually, the federal exposure begins the moment the board proceeds with shareholder authorization after formal notification of manipulated valuation structures." Richard turned toward him sharply. "You are overreacting." "No," Harrison replied calmly. "I am protecting the company." The sentence hit harder than anyone expected because it implied something nobody in the room wanted to say out loud yet. If Harrison was protecting Pierce Global from Richard Halpern, then Richard was no longer being treated like part of the company itself. Madeline Pierce slowly stood from her chair at the head of the table. Every movement she made now felt more controlled than before, as though she were forcing herself not to react emotionally in front of the board. But inside, everything was changing too fast. 12 hours earlier, she believed she was finalizing the largest acquisition in company history. Now she was discovering her late father had secretly placed emergency authority in the hands of a man security nearly removed from the building in front of his daughter. She looked toward Caleb again. "Why did my father never tell me about you?" Caleb remained quiet for a moment. Then he answered softly, "Because he hoped he would never need to." The honesty in the answer silenced the room again. Madeline lowered her eyes briefly. Somewhere beyond the windows, thunder rolled faintly over the city. Sophie shifted closer beside her father and looked around the enormous boardroom. "Is everyone mad?" she asked quietly. Nobody answered immediately. Then, unexpectedly, one older board member near the far side of the table spoke in a gentler voice than anyone had heard from him all morning. "No, sweetheart," he said. "I think everyone is realizing they should have listened sooner." Richard stood abruptly from his chair. "This is absurd," he snapped. "We are allowing a stranger to hijack a corporate vote based on unverifiable accusations and emotional manipulation." Caleb looked directly at him. Calm. Unmoving. "You transferred $78 million through shell vendors tied to Helix contractors over the last 14 months. Richard froze. Completely. Caleb continued before anyone else could speak. "The second transfer happened 3 days after Charles Pierce entered hospice care." Silence. Absolute silence. Madeline slowly turned toward Richard again. Her face had lost all color now. "Tell me that is not true." Richard opened his mouth once. Nothing came out. Harrison Vale quietly removed another document from his briefcase and placed it onto the table. Bank records. Transfer authorizations. Executive approvals. Richard stared at the pages like a man watching the floor collapse beneath him in slow motion. One of the investors whispered under his breath, "My God." Another executive pushed his chair back slightly, as if distance itself suddenly mattered. Caleb Mercer never raised his voice once. That was the part none of them would forget later. No threats. No anger. Just facts delivered quietly enough that every word carried more weight than shouting ever could. Madeline looked down at the paperwork in front of her one final time before speaking. "Effective immediately," she said carefully. "The Helix acquisition vote is suspended pending full legal review." The words echoed across the room like a final verdict. Richard's shoulders visibly dropped the moment he heard them. He understood instantly what everyone else did too. It was over. The deal. The cover-up. The control he thought he still had inside Pierce Global. Gone. Sophie looked up at her father again. "Does that mean we can go home now?" Caleb finally looked down at her, and for the first time all morning, the tension in his face softened slightly. "Almost, sweetheart," he said quietly. "Almost." Nobody in the boardroom moved after Madeline Pierce suspended the acquisition vote. The silence that followed felt deeper than relief and heavier than shock. It felt like the moment after a building survives a collapse by inches and everyone inside slowly realizes how close they came to disaster. Richard Halpern remained standing beside his chair staring at the documents spread across the walnut table. For several seconds, he looked as though he wanted to argue again, but even he understood the room no longer belonged to him. One by one, the board, Members avoided looking in his direction entirely. The distance between him and the rest of the company had already formed. Harrison Vale quietly gathered several legal folders together and spoke without emotion. Corporate counsel will begin immediate internal preservation procedures. Nobody leaves this floor until compliance officers secure all financial records connected to Helix. Richard lowered himself slowly back into his chair like a man who had suddenly aged 10 years in a minute. Madeline did not look at him again. Her attention stayed fixed on Caleb Mercer, standing quietly beside the windows with Sophie leaning against his side. Rain continued sliding down the glass behind them, gray streaks against the Manhattan skyline. The entire morning replayed itself in her mind differently now. The old jacket, the security guards, the police cars outside, the way Caleb never once defended himself even while being treated like an intruder in a company he had technically just saved. Shame settled slowly into her chest. Not loud. Worse. Quiet. She walked around the conference table toward him carefully. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody spoke at all. Sophie looked up first when Madeline stopped in front of them. For the first time that morning, the young chief executive no longer looked intimidating. She looked tired. Human. Mr. Mercer, she said softly, I owe you an apology. Caleb met her eyes calmly. You do not owe me anything. Yes, Madeline replied. I do. The honesty in her voice changed something inside the room again. She glanced briefly towards Sophie before continuing. You walked into this building trying to protect my company, and I answered by calling the police. Caleb remained quiet. Madeline lowered her eyes for a second. My father used to tell me that fear makes people confuse authority with judgment. A faint sad smile touched Caleb's face for the first time all morning. He said that a lot. Madeline looked at him carefully then. You really did know him. Your father trusted people who disagreed with him, Caleb said. That is why he built something worth protecting. The words stayed hanging in the room long after he finished speaking. Several board members slowly lowered their eyes. Because deep down, they all knew the company had almost stopped being worthy of the man who created it. Sophie tugged lightly at Caleb's sleeve. Dad, she whispered, can we really go home now? Caleb looked down at her and gently brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Yeah, sweetheart, he said quietly. We are done here. He reached for the gray envelope still lying on the conference table, but Madeline stopped him gently. Wait. Caleb looked back toward her. Madeline hesitated for a moment before speaking again. Why did you still come after the way this company treated you? Caleb glanced once around the boardroom. At the executives, the lawyers, the skyline beyond the rain-covered windows. Then finally back at Sophie beside him. Because your father once told me that if good people walk away completely, bad people stop getting challenged. Nobody answered after that. There was nothing left to say. Caleb took Sophie's hand and walked toward the boardroom doors in complete silence. No security guards moved. No executive spoke. Even Richard Halpern kept his eyes lowered as Caleb passed him. The doors opened softly. Sophie stopped just before leaving and looked back toward Madeline Pierce, standing alone beside the conference table. Dad says important people are supposed to listen first, she said quietly. Then she slipped her small hand back into her father's and walked out with him into the hallway. The doors closed behind them with a soft click that echoed through the silent boardroom long after they were gone.